Only two sayings are recorded of Thales of Miletus, traditionally the founding father of Greek philosophy. They illustrate the melange of science and religion, for one of them was, "All things are full of gods," and the other was, "Water is the first principle of everything." Thales was a geometer, the first to discover the method of inscribing a right-angled triangle in a circle. He celebrated this discovery by sacrificing an ox to the gods. He measured the height of the pyramids by measuring their shadows at the time of day, when his own shadow was as long as he was tall. He put his geometry to practical use. Having proved that triangles with one equal side and two equal angles are congruent, he used this result to determine the distance of ships at sea. Thales also had a reputation as an astronomer and a meteorologist. In addition to predicting the eclipse, he is said to have been the first to show that the year contained 365 days, and to determine the dates of the summer and winter solstices. He studied the constellations and made estimates of the sizes of the sun and moon. He turned his skill as a weather forecaster to good account. Foreseeing an unusually good olive crop, he took a lease on all the oil mills and made a fortune through his monopoly. Thus, Aristotle said, he showed that philosophers could easily be rich if they wished. If half the stories current about Thales in antiquity are true, he was a man of many parts, but tradition's portrait of him is ambiguous. On the one hand, he figures as a philosophical entrepreneur and a political and military pundit. On the other hand, he became a byword for unworldly absent-mindedness. Plato, among others, tells the following tale. Thales was studying the stars and gazing into the sky when he fell into a well, and a jolly and witty Thracian servant girl made fun of him, saying that he was crazy to know about what was up in the heavens while he could not see what was in front of him beneath his feet. An unlikely story went around that he had met his death by just such a fall while stargazing. Thales was reckoned as one of the 7 sages or wise men of Greece, on a par with Solon, the great legislator of Athens. He is credited with a number of aphorisms. He said that before a certain age, it was too soon for a man to marry, and after that age, it was too late. When asked why he had no children, he said, "Because I am fond of children." Thales's remarks heralded many centuries of philosophical disdain for marriage. Anyone who makes a list of a dozen really great philosophers is likely to discover that the list consists almost entirely of bachelors. One plausible list, for instance, would include Plato, Augustine, Aquinas, Scotus, Descartes, Locke, Spinoza, Hume, Kant, Hegel, and Wittgenstein, none of whom were married. Aristotle is the grand exception that disproves the rule that marriage is incompatible with philosophy. Even in antiquity, people found it hard to understand Thales' adoption of water as the ultimate principle of explanation. The earth, he said, rested on water like a log floating in a stream, but then asked Aristotle, what does the water rest on? He went further and said that everything came from and was in some sense made out of water. Again, his reasons were obscure, and Aristotle could only conjecture that it was because all animals and plants need water to live, or because semen is moist. It is easier to come to grips with the cosmology of Thales' junior compatriot, Anaximander of Miletus. We know rather more about his views because he left behind a book entitled On Nature, written in prose, a medium just beginning to come into fashion. Like Thales, he was credited with a number of original scientific achievements. The first map of the world, the first star chart, the first Greek sundial, and an indoor clock as well. He taught that the earth was cylindrical in shape, like a stumpy column no higher than a third of its diameter. Around the world were gigantic types full of fire. Each type was punctured with a hole through which the fire could be seen from outside, and the holes were the sun and moon and stars. Blockages in the holes accounted for eclipses of the sun and phases of the moon. The celestial fire, which is nowadays largely hidden, was once a great ball of flame around the infant earth. When this ball exploded, the fragments grew types like bark around themselves. Anaximander was much impressed by the way trees grow and shed their bark. He used the same analogy to explain the origin of human beings. Other animals, he observed, can look after themselves soon after birth, but humans need a long nursing. If humans had always been as they are now, the race would not have survived. In an earlier age, he conjectured, humans had spent their childhood encased in a prickly bark, so that they looked like fish and lived in water. At puberty, they shed their bark and stepped out onto dry land, into an environment in which they could take care of themselves. Because of this, Anaximander, though not otherwise a vegetarian, recommended that we abstain from eating fish, as the ancestors of the human race. Anaximander's cosmology is more sophisticated than Thales in several ways. First of all, he does not look for something to support the earth. It stays where it is because it is equidistant from everything else, and there is no reason why it should move in any direction rather than any other. Secondly, he thinks it is an error to identify the ultimate material of the universe with any of the elements we can see around us in the contemporary world, such as water or fire. The fundamental principle of things, he said, must be boundless or undefined, apeiron. Anaximander's Greek word is often rendered as the infinite, but that makes it sound too grand. He may or may not have thought that his principle extended forever in space. What we do know is that he thought it had no beginning and no end in time, and that it did not belong to any particular kind or class of things. Everlasting stuff is probably as close a paraphrase as we can get. Aristotle was later to refine the notion into his concept of prime matter. Thirdly, Anaximander offered an account of the origin of the present world and explained what forces had acted to bring it into existence, inquiring, as Aristotle would say, into the efficient as well as the material cause. He saw the universe as a field of competing opposites, hot and cold, wet and dry. Sometimes one of a pair of opposites is dominant, sometimes the other. They encroach upon each other and then withdraw, and their interchange is governed by a principle of reciprocity. As Anaximander put it poetically in his one surviving fragment, they pay penalty and render reparation to each other for their injustice under the arbitration of time. Thus, one surmises in winter, the hot and the dry make reparation to the cold and the wet for the aggression they committed in summer. Heat and cold were the first of the opposites to make their appearance, separating off from an original cosmic egg of the everlasting indeterminate stuff. From them developed the fire and earth which, we have seen, lay at the origin of our present cosmos. Anaximenes, a generation younger than Anaximander, was the last of the trio of Milesian cosmologists. In several ways he is closer to Thales than to Anaximander, but it would be wrong to think that with him science is going backwards rather than forwards. Like Thales, he thought that the earth must rest on something, but he proposed air rather than water for its cushion. The earth itself is flat, and so are the heavenly bodies. These, instead of rotating above and below us in the course of a delta, circle horizontally around us like a bonnet rotating around a head. The rising and setting of the heavenly bodies is explained, apparently, by the tilting of the flat earth. As for the ultimate principle, Anaximenes found Anaximander's boundless matter too rarefied a concept, and opted, like Thales, for a single one of the existing elements as fundamental, though again he opted for air rather than water. In its stable state, air is invisible, but when it is moved and condensed it becomes first wind and then cloud and then water, and finally water condensed becomes mud and stone. Rarefied air became fire, thus completing the gamut of the elements. In this way, rarefaction and condensation can conjure everything out of the underlying air. In support of this claim, Anaximenes appealed to experience, and indeed to experiment, an experiment that the reader can easily carry out for herself. Blow on your hand, first with the lips pursed, and then from an open mouth. The first time the air will feel cold, and the second time hot. This, argued Anaximenes, shows the connection between density and temperature. The use of experiment and the insight that changes of quality are linked to changes of quantity. Mark Anaximenes as a scientist in embryo. Only in embryo, however, he has no means of measuring the quantities he invokes. He devises no equations to link them, and his fundamental principle retains mythical and religious properties. Air is divine and generates deities out of itself. Air is our soul and holds our bodies together. The Milesians, then, are not yet real physicists, but neither are they myth makers. They have not yet left myth behind, but they are moving away from it. They are not true philosophers either, unless by philosophy. One simply means infant science. They make little use of conceptual analysis, and the a priori argument that has been the stock in trade of philosophers from Plato to the present day. They are speculators, in whose speculations elements of philosophy, science, and religion mingle in a rich and heady brew.